Welcome to Last Orders, the Spiked podcast on all things nanny state. I'm Tom Slater, Deputy Editor of Spiked, and this is the show where myself and Chris Snowdon from the Institute of Economic Affairs discuss the latest news in public health killjoyism, all with the help of an invited guest. In this episode, we're joined by the Angry Chef, aka Anthony Warner, to discuss the truth about fat, plans for calorie caps in restaurants and supermarkets, and the Lancet's call for a global near-vegan diet. Hello and welcome to Last Orders, the Spiked podcast on all things nanny state. I'm Tom Slater, Deputy Editor at Spiked, and this month, as ever, I'm joined by the Director of Lifestyle Economics at the Institute of Economic Affairs, as well as the author of Killjoys, Chris Snowdon. Hello, Chris.
Hello.
And today we're delighted to be joined by the chef and blogger and author, a fierce critic of food fads and food snobbery, the self-styled Angry Chef himself, Anthony Warner. Anthony, thanks so much for being with us today.
Hi.
So to kick things off, we're going to talk about obesity and specifically your latest book, Anthony, The Truth About Fat, in which you cut through what you see as some of the myths and the sort of prejudices pervading a lot of the discussion about obesity. But before we delve into all of that, I'm sure many of our listeners will be aware of your work. But for those who aren't, can you just tell us a little bit about your background, how you ended up writing about these issues, why you're so angry?
Yeah, I don't know about why I'm so angry. I mean, I do write a character. I created a character on a blog, so I apologise if I'm not as angry as expected. I'm sure something will irritate me at some point. I'm a chef. I've been a chef for 20, 25 years, and half of that time in restaurants and hotels and sort of fairly high-end catering, and then half of that time as a development chef for the food manufacturing industry. Which is what I currently do now. And a few years ago, I was kind of getting annoyed, irritated by a lot of the sort of fad diets and the clean eating Instagram style diets that are around, and increasingly irritated by the sort of health claims that were being made, ridiculous, pseudoscientific claims. And I actually have a background in biochemistry. So I have a pretty good idea of what constitutes good and bad science. And some of the stuff I was seeing was, it was absurd, but it was also quite dangerous. And I'm someone who dedicated my life to cooking, and I love food, and I felt that there were people out there who were needlessly demonising perfectly sensible foods and really helping a lot of people develop a really complex and dangerous relationship with how they eat. And so I thought it was a good idea to have a voice out there which was saying something, sort of calling out some of these diets and calling out some of these people. And I created the character on the blog, The Angry Chef, and it became sort of... it was actually originally intended just to be for a few of my mates in the food industry, just to sort of laugh at some of these ridiculous things. But it kind of hit a bit of a nerve, because I think people were a bit sick of being made to feel terrible about how they eat and what they were doing, and made to feel guilty, and made to feel that their food they were eating was somehow unclean and dirty and contaminated. It became pretty popular pretty quickly, and it led very quickly to a book and writing for various other people, and a column for the Sunday Times and all sorts of things like that. So yeah, I'm on my second book now.
And on that second book, so it's on the question of obesity, which is a constant issue of public discussion. I know you spent a lot of time talking to all manner of experts for this, from nutritionists, scientists, economists even, to try and get at the root of what's really at stake here. So what do you think we're getting wrong at the moment when we talk about obesity and fat?
Yeah, I think we sort of massively misunderstand the problem a lot of the time, and a lot of people try to simplify it, and there's a big industry of people trying to oversimplify it and turn a very complex systemic issue into something which is easily solved, and they happen to have a solution in their new diet book or their new sort of policy intervention, or they sort of think that these things have a simple solution. You look at the science of obesity, and it's I think the real thing to understand is we talk about an epidemic. It's an endemic problem, not an epidemic one. When you feed a population of people with, when you give them enough food to eat, a certain number of people will be different sizes and shapes to other people, and some of those will be classified as being overweight, some will be classified as being obese. Those sort of classifications are reasonably arbitrary, really, in terms of health outcomes, and certainly there's sort of health problems associated with people getting to very high weights. But for the vast majority of people, even if they're classified as being overweight, and even if they're classified as being obese in many cases, good health behaviours are going to be far more effective way of improving their lives than forcing themselves into temporary starvation. The biggest myth of all is this idea that temporarily starving yourself is a good way to improve your health. And that's what the diet industry depends on. Thousands of people around the world make their living from selling that myth that if you temporarily starve yourself, that's a way to a better you and a better place and better health. And it's just not true. Our body does not like being starved, and it does not like being forced to be a different weight, and it fights you all the way, and you will eventually put that weight back on. And the vast majority of diets fail because otherwise the industry that supports them would disappear because because no one would need to diet anymore. When we're being adequately fed, the heritability of your body weight is about 70 to 80%. 70 to 80% governed by your genetics. And it's compared to height, which is about 80%. So it's comparable to height in terms of how heritable it is when we're being adequately fed. And people wonder why we have higher rates of obesity and overweight now than we had 50 years ago. Well, probably one of the main reasons is a certain amount of time ago, not everyone was getting enough food to eat, and now most people are getting enough food to eat, so we have more obesity. But I mean, the thing that sort of upsets me the most about the diet industry in general is one of our sort of natural reactions to this idea of sort of temporarily starving yourself to lose weight is that what your body will then do, because it thinks that there's a threat to food, this is an evolved response over many years. It will eventually reset its weight to a little bit higher in a lot of cases. So often people who are trying to lose weight through dieting are eventually ending up sort of heavier than they were before. In fact, the majority of people who go on weight loss diets end up at a higher weight than they started.
And Chris, feel free to come back on anything that Anthony's just said there. But on the question of, we talk about the obesity epidemic, we talk about the obesity crisis, we talk a lot on this podcast about how sometimes public health claims in particular are a little bit overblown. I mean, is it fair to say that there's grounds to say some of the claims being made about not just the scale of obesity, but the problem of it on people's health is exaggerated, shall we say, or are they just proposing the wrong solutions to a very real problem?
I don't know whether the claims about health itself are exaggerated. Probably a bit, and probably as time goes on, they become more exaggerated. But I mean, the basic fact that obesity is a major risk factor for type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and various other things is not to be questioned. There is a lot of exaggeration and outright lies. I mean, I've written quite a bit about the childhood obesity stats, which are just ludicrous. 37% of 11-year-olds supposedly now are overweight or obese. I mean, how can anyone actually believe this unless you spend no time whatsoever with children? I mean, it's just impossible. If you have children at school, you cannot possibly believe this. Or it's nowhere near 37%. Quite obviously, it's I have friends who are teachers, and I try and ask them, how many kids do you think at your school are obese? I asked the deputy head of a school that has more than 1,000 people, and he had to scratch his head, and he goes, I can think of one, maybe two. I mean, it's different in different parts of the country, yes, but it's nowhere near that. And we'll go into the reasons why the statistics are essentially fraudulent, but they are. And the economic consequences of obesity are massively exaggerated, which is why I'm not that interested in it really as an issue. I just don't care. I mean, what happened to the old thing about take people as they are, no matter what size, colour, weight, or what have you? That seems to have gone out the window. People are making other people's weight their own business. It isn't really their business at all. You might not find it aesthetically pleasing, but that's about the limit of it. The only real externality is kind of the issue of what to do about very fat people on aeroplanes, as far as I can see. But the claim made about the NHS is going to bankrupt the NHS, it's a time bomb. It's all nonsense, really. For the same reason as smoking was never actually a time bomb for the NHS. In fact, smoking saves money, and probably obesity is, if not saving money, costing a relatively small amount, or is probably in reality a wash, because people have to die of something, and they're quite likely to die of something more expensive after many more years of taking out of the public pot by the time they die. So from a strictly economic point of view, there isn't any reason to be concerned. about obesity. You can be concerned for other people, of course. That's a different kettle of fish. And you can identify possibly areas where the government could usefully intervene. You know, I don't think it's implausible that there are people who are heavier than they would like to be because they don't know, you know, that there are a huge number of calories in all sorts of different products. Alcohol, I think, is the best example here. I think a lot of people are totally ignorant about how many calories are in a pint of beer, for example, which is it's over 200 calories. So yeah, possibly there is room for government intervention on the public health education side, but it's not really a big deal. It's not important, and most of the people who profess to claim about it actually are just interested in controlling what people eat.
Mm. And Anthony, I know you've written before about how so many of these discussions about health and food have kind of screwed up people's relationship to food and their own health and their own bodies, etc. Do you think there's a certain irony in the fact that there's often a lot of concern about the effects on body image of advertising or magazine covers or whatever, whilst the kind of constant drumbeat about food and the wrong sorts of foods to eat and why they need to be clamped down upon, etc., is almost treated as an unalloyed good? Does a lot of that kind of discussion actually also have an impact unfairly on how people think about what they eat and what they look like as well?
Yeah, certainly on what they look like. There's no doubt about that. You know, the prejudice we have against weight in our society and in sort of most societies around the world is extraordinary and extraordinarily damaging, and is completely perpetuated by this. By all sorts of messages, by a diet industry and by public health messaging that, you know, any amount of overweight and obesity is a bad thing, and it's a moral thing, and it's caused by willpower. And it's basically, you know, the classic prejudice of looking at someone's external characteristics and attributing sort of morality to that, or attributing sort of moral characteristics. And you know, it's incredibly offensive and incredibly unpleasant. Like I said, most of it, you know, is genetically determined. Most of our body weight is genetically determined, and we're you know, people experience extraordinary amounts of abuse, which is incredibly damaging for their health. And you look at many of the things that sort of abuse can produce, many of the health harms that can produce, and then many of the same things we attribute to, you know, what's caused by sort of body weight, like the sort of cardiovascular disease and like even sort of inflammatory related diseases. These are things perpetuated by stress and, you know, mental health problems which are associated with larger body weight. And we don't really know how much of that is due to the physical effect of having a larger amount of body fat, and how much is due to the stigma, the lived experience of living in a stigmatized body. And the reason why we don't know is because it's impossible. There's no society where we can look at that in isolation, because every single person who lives in a larger body experiences that sort of stigmatization and prejudice. And, you know, I think that's something we have to think about and sort of talk about more, because, you know, it's sort of cloaked in this sort of veil of kindness, but it's just stigmatization and abuse and unpleasantness, and is incredibly harmful for people's health. So, you know, why don't we just stop doing that? I can't think of a reason why.
Would you apply the same thing to smokers though? Because, I mean, part of the anti-smoking campaign over the years, which I think has been to some extent successful, has been the stigmatization and denormalization of smokers. And I don't hear people saying, well, if you stigmatize smokers, they'll smoke twice as much. I mean, the belief seems to be that actually some of those people will, as a result, decide to quit smoking.
Well, I mean, yeah, smoking is a behaviour. Obesity
is excessive eating.
Excessive eating doesn't necessarily lead to obesity. I think that's the thing, that the idea that those two things are exactly the same is, I don't think that's true. You know, you look at most adult weight gain occurs at a rate of about 1-2 pounds of fat per year, and that's not caused by constant excessive eating. That's not a calorie excess caused by constant. That's caused by a very
Christmas
sort of slow,
and holidays,
incremental gain over a long time. To say obesity is a behaviour is, I think that's one of the most problematic things, because you can look at, you can have a sort of 10, 20 people obese. Who are obese, and they would be for completely different reasons, and there would be different reasons underlying that, and some of that might be, driven by specific genetic differences. Some of it might be driven by mental health problems. Some of it might be driven by, there's a million reasons why someone might be overweight. And to say, obesity is not a behaviour, and telling someone not to be obese is just not a helpful thing to do. It will never, it's like telling someone who is drowning to just swim some more. So I think that is one of the big misconceptions I think about how we deal with obesity is we think of it as a behaviour, and it's listed with other behaviour. Public Health England have done that, listed it as a sort of behaviour. Eating a poor quality diet, that is a behaviour, and that's something we can address, but it won't necessarily address obesity. Exercise is a behaviour, which is something we should encourage, but that almost always doesn't lead to weight loss, because you just sort of compensate with the amount you eat when you exercise.
Do you see it as disease? Because that was something in the news recently. The Royal College of something like physicians, I think, said that it should be reclassified as disease, and we will never be able to tackle it unless we do. Is what
I don't think that. I mean, I'm not an expert on that. What should and shouldn't be classified as a disease? I don't think that's helpful, because I think it's not a single thing. It's caused by many different reasons, and a lot of it, like I said, is endemic. And if someone can have, we talk about how health harms of obesity, and obviously there's a relationship, but someone can have BMI of over 30, and that can be the weight at which they're most healthy. And that's pretty. And it's if what we should be doing is trying to encourage sort of healthy behaviours independent of weight. We should be encouraging people to exercise. We should be encouraging people to eat a better quality diet. We should be encouraging people. I think we should be encouraging people not to smoke. If we're laser focused on the fact that their weight is the one thing that determines how healthy they are, which I think we have very much these days, then we'll miss the sort of positive behaviours which could actually help people be healthier, whatever weight they are. It might help them get to a lower weight, but it might not. But they'll still be healthier. So why don't we just try and encourage positive health behaviours rather than telling people not to be something which is mostly genetically determined.
On that point, Chris, and you've kind of already raised it with some of your points there, but do you think there's a bit of a danger of, so much of the interventions that we talk about on this podcast are often now levelled not in a kind of like moralistic way to say you shouldn't be doing this. It's say a lot of people can't help themselves for whatever reason, and therefore you have to sort of intervene on that level. Taking Anthony's point about the heritability and stuff into account, is there still a role here for stressing personal responsibility in relation to weight, do you think? Or is it something that we do need to be a bit more nuanced about?
Well, yeah, we do need to be more nuanced. I think Anthony definitely makes a good point about the heritability aspect of it. At the same time, I'm a bit uncomfortable with getting to a situation where you basically absolve people of all responsibility. And, I mean, talking about the genetics is one side of that, which doesn't tend to get brought up very often. The other side of it is the more public health position of it's the environment, it's the industry, it's everyone but you. And I actually don't think that's particularly useful for people. I don't think it's ever useful for people to feel that they have no control over their lives, and it's not their fault if they can't stop eating deep pan pizzas and sitting on the sofa all day. There's elements of different parts of it, and I mean, even the environment and stuff has some impact clearly, but it suits the public health lobby to portray human beings as hapless pawns, because then it's just a matter then for the government to reshape society around them.
Yeah. And on that question, Anthony, about the obesogenic environment that's sometimes talked about, and because I know you've written a lot about the kind of implicit snobbery often in a lot of the discussion about food. And when you see kind of proposals about what we really need to do is get rid of chicken shops near schools, etc., do you think that's one driver of a lot of the discussion around obesity as well, a kind of sense about that horrible food that the lower orders are eating and why they shouldn't be eating it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and this is why I seem to upset everybody, because I do feel that sort of narrative that they, in inverted commas, can't be trusted in the environment. But obviously, people of a lower weight presumably can resist and have more willpower. And I think there's this idea of framing people as hapless pawns and unable to resist the sort of evil manipulations of corporations. I think is very damaging. You have to give people agency and understand that they do make decisions in an environment, and understand that the decisions people make actually the ones that make sense in their lives. And really just reshaping, and also that people people's demand shapes the environment very much, and if you just take away the thing that you think is doing harm, people are going there for a reason. They're not just going to, if you take away chicken shops, then people aren't going to just have a glass of water instead. They're going to find they're going to find something else that fills the gap that thing provides in their lives.
Hi, I hope you're enjoying the show so far. So, as Spiked readers and listeners to this podcast will know, Spiked has no paywall and no subscriptions. It's contributions from our readers, from our listeners, that keep us going and growing. So to those who already give, thank you very much. And if you'd like to make a donation, or even better, set up a monthly donation, just go to spiked-online.com and hit the big red donate button in the top right of the homepage. Anything you can give really is greatly appreciated. Now, back to the show. Next up, let's talk about calorie caps. So in plans that were found out about over the Christmas break, Public Health England is considering putting calorie limits on food in restaurants and supermarkets. Things like ready meals, pizzas, onion bhajis, and even salads are among the foods that might fall under this new calorie cap. And it seems to be part of a broader trend that we've talked about a lot here, which is the public health establishment not necessarily just trying to ward you off certain choices and trying to tax you out of certain bad behaviours, etc., but actually trying to take away that bad choice at source by intervening in recipes and things of that nature. So, Chris, can you just tell us a little bit more about this calorie cap plan and also where it came from, because it doesn't seem to have come out of nowhere?
Yes, indeed. It came out on Boxing Day. The Telegraph got hold of a leaked copy of Public Health England's plans, and the response from the public was, as I expected, kind of laughter and disbelief, to the point where I think actually a lot of people just didn't take it seriously. They maybe assumed that if it indeed did come from Public Health England, it was some sort of 5 o'clock in the afternoon brainstorm, rather than actually what is a well-documented government policy going back to 2015. It is in both chapters of the childhood obesity strategy in black and white. Public Health England have put out numerous reports talking about what they're doing, why they're doing it, and exactly what the schedule is. These calorie caps, or something very close to them, will be published around about Easter time. It's always been the plan to put them out around about Easter time. I don't see how they're going to be much different from the ones that the Telegraph has already leaked. And then people will have to finally understand that this is actually real. This is really happening. And about time, because I have been writing about this for quite a while and nobody seemed very interested in it. So I was glad to see it really pick up when the Telegraph got these particular figures. But the idea is it's all the reformulation stuff, really, that they've been trying to push for quite a few years, starting with sugar, but now also moving on to calories in general. And the plan, in its kind of cretinous simplicity, is to, it starts from the point that people are eating too many calories. We can make people eat fewer calories by shrinking the food or somehow magically reformulating the food with fewer calories in it. And how exactly they've come to these caps, I'm not quite sure. It may simply be a case that they've looked at the average number of calories in each of these individual products and shaved a fifth off. I don't know. But they can't be met. I mean, they're ridiculous. I mean, they're incredibly pernickety as well. I mean, it's like exactly 544 calories in a ready meal or something like that, So any normal restaurant, pub, cafe, what have you, is not, they're not going to be able to abide by these. It would essentially ban, if they were actually mandatory, it would essentially ban like fish and chips, a fry up, most normal foods. So we will see what happens, but this is the whole reformulation plan coming to the boil, and people need to get to grips with it. The government's going to obviously get the blame for it, because ultimately it is government policy. They can't keep blaming Public Health England all the time. Public Health England only really do what the government tells them to do, admittedly after some arm twisting perhaps from the people at Public Health England. But this is government policy. It's an absolutely mental policy, and they can't possibly go ahead with it. And I think it is a looming fiasco for the government, because they're going to have to do some kind of U-turn.
Anthony, what do you make of all of this? As mental as Chris thinks.
I think there's a place for reformulation to make food healthier. Not sure whether that's best achieved by a calorie cap. I'd much rather we were trying to, increase people's consumption of fruit and vegetables, increase people's consumption of fibre and that sort of thing. It would probably be perfectly acceptable to achieve some of the calorie limits on certain types of food, which are perfectly nice sorts of food. But on something like a lasagna or something like that, it'd be incredibly difficult to get that. You'd have a tiny little square of lasagna. So, and we just eat a variety of different things every day, and some of them will be higher in calories, and we should sort of carry on doing that, because that's that sort of variety is the best way to enjoy an interesting diet and have a good relationship. Eat different things all the time and eat some things which are higher in calories than other things. And this idea of sort of standardising food in that way is ridiculous. Like I said, no fish and chips, no fried breakfast, that sort of thing. But that said, there is a I'm a development chef in the food industry. I spent a lot of time, sort of changing recipes to take salt out first, and then to take sugar out, and then to reduce calories. And there is good work you can do in that area, and you can sort of take a certain amount of calories out of things without people noticing. There's some pretty good evidence that you can do that, and people won't compensate by eating more later on. I mean, I've said this a few times before. If you're doing something like if you have a biscuit or something like that, the actual how you take calories out of that is incredibly difficult to do. First of all, people say just take sugar out. Well, if you take sugar out, you have to replace it with something. That'll probably be fat, which is more calorie dense than sugar, so you'll end up with something with more calories. So you kind of just have to shrink it, and make it smaller. In many cases, is the only way to reduce calories in something, which I think some people don't perhaps appreciate,
including people of Public Health England, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, sometimes, yeah. I mean, something like a drink, you can put sweeteners. I know might make them taste different, and you need to be really careful. But with some clever reformulation, you can take some of the sugar out and you can put a sweetener in. But with some things, it's just not that simple. And are we really saying all biscuits and chocolate bars should be made smaller to comply with some sort of arbitrary calorie cap?
Essentially, that's what's going to happen. It's all you can do with a chocolate bar or sweets or biscuits and probably possibly most things. The only thing you can actually do is make them smaller. And we've already seen this week, Office for National Statistics put some figures out showing shrinkflation, which they explicitly do not blame on Brexit, by the way, which is everybody's excuse. They don't explicitly blame Public Health England, unfortunately, which would be the next step for them to be wholly truthful about it. But surprise, surprise, the products that have shrunk the most in the last 2 or 3 years have been food products. And in particular, actually, sugary or sweet products, because you can't do anything else. Artificial sweeteners weigh something like 1/100th of sugar. They've got nothing to them, essentially. They're only any good for sweetening drinks, because it doesn't matter about the weight or the texture of the drink, obviously. You can't do it, as Anthony says, with biscuits, because what do you replace it with? Sugar provides an enormous amount of texture, apart from the fact that the sugar just tastes nicer to the vast majority of people. And, if you're trying to lose weight, don't eat biscuits. I mean, that's... this whole thing started with Public Health England when Action on Sugar were going through all the pasta sauces and the cereals and stuff that maybe you wouldn't expect there'd be that much sugar in. Savoury dishes. Why is there so much sugar in a jar of, pasta sauce, lasagna sauce? Okay, well, actually, largely because it's got tomatoes in, tomatoes have got sugar, but apart from that, there is still added sugar. You can understand why some people might be a bit surprised that there's sugar in some of those products. But it very quickly moved on to, well, we need to do the same thing with cakes and biscuits and chocolates. Well, no, because A, you can't. They're going to taste horrible and going to have no texture. And B, these are obviously sugary treats, right? People do not think they are in any way health foods. They're not even part of the core diet, right? Just don't eat them if you're concerned about your weight.
But also, we do forget sometimes that not everybody needs to lose weight. Some people, some people need sources of calories. People talk about why are these. You have a picture of some food on sale in a hospital, and people say, why are these products on sale in cafes and hospitals? Well, you speak to a lot of dietitians and health workers. They'll say a lot of people in hospitals struggle to get enough calories into their bodies, and calorie-dense things are actually a useful thing to have. And if you sort of get rid of all of them and you just replace it all with whatever they're planning on replacing it with, fibre or, whole grain bread, then that's problematic for some people. Some people, people have different needs when it comes to food. You can't standardise everyone's diet. It's a ridiculous thing to try and do. And when you do that, you just kind of reduce the variety of food that people are eating and reduce the enjoyment they're getting from food. almost all the dietary problems we have, I think, come from people demonising certain foods and saying certain things are bad because, that is just creates a problematic relationship. The low carb people will say the worst thing we ever did was demonise fat back in the 70s. I agree that was a bad thing to do because, it was just meant, because demonising one single thing, especially one single sort of macronutrient, is a ridiculous relationship to have with food. But now, the alternative seems to be demonising another thing and demonising sugar, and it just seems like ridiculous. Why don't we just have a better relationship with what we eat and enjoy certain things and appreciate things for what they are, rather than constantly sort of moralising about what And then now we're going to demonise calories, which we do actually need.
You make a very good point about percentages. I mean, they just look at the whole population. This is one of the problems with public health is it just look at aggregate figures and they say, well, the average person is eating 100 calories too many. Therefore, we're going to try and take out 100 calories from the daily food supply. It doesn't obviously work like that. And there are plenty of people who need to consume more calories, plenty of people who are consuming more or less the right number of calories. But this is what happens with central planning. You get this top-down view of this is what the average citizen looks like. And it's similar to what you were saying about trans fats. It's a very good point. On average, most people are not consuming too many of them. That doesn't mean that quite a few people, are not consuming too many.
And just finally, before we move on, what's the response been from the food industry, Chris? Because they seem to have been pretty timid in response to some pretty crazy encroachments on what it is that they're producing. Is that about right?
It feels like that to me. I mean, you don't get the sense that there's a huge organisation of protest and opposition going on. They seem to be pretty much lying down. And I'm not 100% sure of the reasons. I think there's a few different reasons. One, I think there's a bit of a principal agent problem in some of these big food companies because the CEOs just do not stick around for very long. And so if you're talking about giving the government a promise that you'll have done something by 2020, then you can make that promise and know that you'll be in another country quite soon. The other issue is they are big incumbent industries and regulation tends not to harm them. Even the kind of regulation the government's talking about with banning discounts and banning advertising and so on, they know full well people will still be buying their products. I mean, people obviously will keep buying food anyway. They're not really bothered what type of food they buy. They'll still be buying it from supermarkets and from big food companies no matter what. So they're not that concerned about it. And I think the other aspect is this, they weren't expecting this, This has really come out of the blue from about 2015. There was no real pressure on the food industry. There was no demonization of big food, apart from in a few pockets of extremists. So this has come out of nowhere. It's not happened in any other countries. It's not even been discussed really in any other countries. It's calorie cap madness. So I just don't. I think they're completely shocked, and they've been shocked into inaction really.
Before we get into the final section of the podcast, I just wanted to let you know about a great way that you can support the podcast, you can support the show, get our message out there to more and more people that will cost you nothing and take just 1 minute of your time. All you've got to do is give us a rating and a review with your chosen podcast provider. It really is that simple and it will be a huge help. So thanks so much for your support and back to the show. So finally, let's move on and talk about the Lancet's plan for a sustainable, healthy and, dare I say it, joyless diet for the world. So this month the Lancet published the results of the Eat Lancet Commission and its dietary guidelines for, as I say, feeding the world. So the magic formula, it turns out, is something pretty close to veganism, I guess, or near veganism. So sustaining ourselves on grains, fruit, vegetables, being allowed the occasional bit of milk, a whopping 1.5 eggs each week, and a tenth of a sausage per day if you're feeling a bit naughty. So Chris, can you tell us a bit more about this particular plan and how they would expect it to be enforced if it was actually as good as they say it is?
Well, it's a collaboration between EAT, which is a campaign group set up by a billionaire businessman from Norway and his wife, both of whom I assume are vegans, or at least vegetarians. And they pumped a whole load of money into this thing, and they're currently jet-setting around the world on a global tour to encourage governments to follow their guidance. And so they've got into bed with the Lancet, which used to be a respectable medical journal back in the day, until Richard Horton took it over and used it as a sort of organ for social justice and revolution. And yeah, that's given it, I suppose, a bit more credibility than it might otherwise have had. And the diet itself is sort of designed with a nod to sustainability and combating climate change and water depletion, that kind of thing. But it's also meant to be the optimally healthy diet. And in fact, when push came to shove, it's more about health than it is about environmentalism. They said that from an environmental point of view, it should be 100% vegan. So they put meat in there because they don't fully accept that a vegan diet is healthier. But not very much meat, 7 grams of pork, 7 grams of beef, 29 grams of chicken per day. These are very, very small quantities, as you'll see if you look at the videos I made recently, which I tried to have my breakfast, lunch, and tea under those guidelines. And even things like potatoes are incredibly stingy rations, kind of half a small potato a day. It's mainly lentils and beans and starchy carbs that they're expecting people to live off. And they know that people won't do this voluntarily, and they make it very explicit in the report that we need to have lots of very, very hardcore draconian government regulation up to and including possibly rationing in order to bring this about. Going back to what Anthony said before about snobbery towards people in low-income areas who go to chicken shops, they explicitly say in the report that there needs to be a clampdown on fast food outlets in low-income areas. They explicitly say in low-income areas.
So they're not even trying to hide it.
No, they didn't need to put that in, did they? They could quite easily have said, look, we want to have clampdown takeaways. But no, it's specifically the low-income people they've got a problem with. This really is literally a billionaire telling poor people how to live. And trying to push his trendy diet onto the rest of the world by force, by getting governments to come together, accept these ludicrous targets, and then use everything they can think of to force people into it.
Anthony, what do you make of all of this?
It's a very strange report, very strangely written report. Because you can't help but sort of consider these are incredibly serious issues we're talking about. Global warming and the effect of agriculture and our food supply on climate change is such an important issue, and I think you'd probably struggle to find anyone who seriously doesn't think that there is perhaps a problem with the environmental impact of how we eat now, and perhaps a need to cut down on meat. But the way the targets were framed as, like I said, the few grams of pork, 7 grams of beef. I mean, it's just giving people like Chris here just an open goal, isn't it? I mean, really, just absolutely absurd. Honestly, it just I think that is the most frustrating thing, because these are incredibly important issues that they're not trivialising them, but they're just communicating them in the most absurd way, which is just going to make people disconnect with it. No one's going to be weighing out 7 grams of beef to have tonight, well, apart from you. But so much of the health stuff was so sort of arbitrarily written. And there's no doubt that there's a need for the world to somehow find a way to cut down on meat, but you need to have an intelligent and considered conversation about how that is actually going to be achieved. And there's so many better reports out there that have been produced last year on exactly the same subject about how we get to a sort of sustainable future of our food supply. That this one just seemed absolutely absurd, and so much. It felt, parts of it felt so biased towards this sort of vegan is best narrative, which I find. I do find extremely troubling, and just like to make people disconnect with it. It's just such a poor report on such a serious and important topic, which is just designed to make people laugh out loud at how ridiculous the things are. I don't understand how so much money and investment and time is invested in a report and come out with it something that ends up looking like that, which is just open for ridicule. I think it's disappointing.
And given how ridiculous it is, Chris, is it something that we shouldn't be worried about anytime soon? I mean, is it just red meat to you and grist to your meal, or is this something that we could see measures like this creeping in? Because one thing that is striking is some of the policy proposals that you talk about. These are things that have been discussed by public health types in Britain for a very long time. Questions about fast food restaurants in working class areas, etc. The whole public health infrastructure actually is already kind of in place for a lot of this stuff. This is just the more extreme, crazy, taken to the nth degree version of all that.
Well, we are doing quite a bit of it, to be fair. We're one of the only countries really that's already taking on some of these recommendations. Sally Khan's just banned so-called junk food advertising on the tube. We've got the sugar tax. We've been talking apparently about meat tax and a pudding tax in recent months. So I'm a bit split on it. I mean, Anthony is right that it was fantastic news when I saw it. I thought, this is it. Surely now people are going to realise that I've been right about all this stuff. All the warnings, all the stuff about the slippery slope. Yes, Snowden's been vindicated. And very few people seem to give it much support. A large part of me was very happy that they did it because it is kind of the absurd conclusion of a lot of the policies that we've seen over the recent years. But another part of me worries about shifting the Overton window. I don't know if it was a deliberate attempt to be so extreme that you move the acceptable barriers of conversation, but I think that probably will be its effect. And so people will go, well, obviously, we're not going to have a ration of 7 grams of pork a day. However, maybe it would be a good idea to tax pork a bit to get people's consumption down. We're eating vastly more than the ideal amount, so we need to start, banning the advertising of it or what have you, the usual nanny state policies. So I think that is a concern. And probably when all is said and done, particularly given the resources that these guys have got to keep pushing this for years and years at the highest levels of government, I think ultimately it will not be a good thing.
Mm. And on the kind of veganism aspect to this, Anthony, while we've got you here, because you have written a lot about food fads, not to just dismiss it as that, but it does seem that recently being a vegan has taken on almost the kind of moral high ground. We're still in the midst of veganuary, which is the worst portmanteau of all time. What do you make of that? The fact that particularly in the last 12 months, but increasingly over the last couple of years, that veganism has been held up as what any actually responsible person would do, both for their own health and for the planet. Do we have to be a bit more robust in taking up some of those claims?
I have a complex relationship with many vegans on social media. I'm someone who says people should have complete freedom to eat whatever they want. That would be great if we kind of let people eat a certain diet and left them alone, and just as long as they don't start trying to force that diet onto other people and kind of define it as some sort of perfect or right or some morally superior way to eat, which it just isn't. It's just what you have for your dinner, isn't it? And these sort of absolutes are always quite problematic. I think eating more vegetables is a very good thing that we should all sort of get behind doing. It's a positive health behaviour, and if we can encourage people to do that, that's great. There are problems with vegan diet, in terms of health. There are things that you will struggle to get, and certainly you can manage that, and people can eat perfectly healthily and be vegan. But you definitely need to take a B12 supplement. You probably need to think about vitamin D, and you probably need to think about some of your omega-3 oils as well. So I worry that when we just talk about these sort of extremes, of you're either vegan or you're not, then that becomes problematic. Especially now you get carnivores who are, as the ultimate sort of extreme anti-vegan message. People have been pushed to saying they're carnivores, and that's their sort of status. And and you get people
paleo diet.
People picture sending vegans pictures of them eating massive steaks and stuff like that. There's a sort of owning them by saying we don't care about the planet. Oh, well, that's fine. I worry about when we go to extremes.
This kind of weird culture war that's
there's lots of sensible vegans out there. There's loads of I've known people who've been vegan for many years, and they eat perfectly well, and they have a good relationship with food, and they do so for moral reasons.
The funny thing about this Eat Lancet report is I ended up on the same side of the argument as the low-carb, paleo, keto loons who normally hate me, and they'd hate Anthony as well. I knew they'd be up in arms about it because they're really into the red meat in particular. So they came out against this strongly. But they did it in their usual way, which was just to kind of besmirch or question the motives of the people who were doing it. And saying Walter Willett, one of the authors of the study, one of the low carb people on Twitter was going, this guy's got a conflict of interest because he's been recommending people eat more vegetables since 1990. No, that's not a conflict of interest. That's just just being consistent. One of the authors is a vegan. Well, if you believe that meat is killing the planet, it would make sense for you to be a vegan. He'd be kind of a hypocrite otherwise. You can't win, can you? Either you've got a conflict of interest because you're ideologically inclined towards a certain position, or you live your life according to what your academic research recommends, or you're a hypocrite hypocrite for not doing it.
It's amazing that, it's like I said, those the same crowd, there's very much a signal. You look at their social media profiles and the first thing is low carb, high fat or paleo, and that's the most important thing about them. They end up just being completely, unable to look objectively at anything, and we'll say no. There's no environmental impact of beef's fine because I saw this YouTube video about carbon sequestration and stuff like that. They're just unable to see any harm in the way they're doing it, and vegans are the same. People can't sort of seem to have a nuanced view on a lot of these dietary issues, which I think is what's needed. And I think that's the problem with the Eat Lancet report, is it just felt far too much to be pushing a vegan diet. Some of the way they presented the evidence, I thought was absolutely, especially on the health, which is something I know a little bit more about, it was absolutely shocking, I thought. But I wouldn't want it to lessen the impact of the importance of the subject matter of the environmental impact of food, because that's incredibly important and something that we do need to think about. But I worry that it just makes it a joke for a lot of people.
Anthony, Chris, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Last Orders. If you enjoyed it, be sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Do take a moment to give us a rating and a review. And if you'd like to support Spiked directly, please do consider making a donation. Just go to spiked-online.com and hit the big red donate button. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.